Welcome to Aspire, and I Have the Right To podcast, where we amplify voices, share stories, and drive change in the fight against sexual assault. We explore the critical issues surrounding student safety, institutional accountability, and survivor empowerment. In every episode, our goal is to provide insightful conversations with survivors, experts, educators, and advocates, giving you, our listener, valuable information, resources, and actionable steps to create safer environments and cultivate a culture of respect and consent. Welcome back to another episode of Aspire. This week, we are blessed to have a special guest, Jack Spiegel, who's joining us. Jack is a recent graduate of Quinnipiac College's master's program in media and communications. He is an accomplished photographer. He has produced his first podcast. But what especially has impressed me about Jack, because I met Jack earlier this year, is a young man who's doing amazing work, who has discovered a powerful voice inside of him and has decided to use it for positive change and impact. I can't think of a better discussion to have today with my two co-hosts, Hugh Eastman and Gabriel Viscogliosi, two other fine young men who are using their voices for change. But I will turn it over to Jack so you could introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex and Hugh and Gabriel. I appreciate you guys all having me. Like Alex said, I am a recent graduate of Quinnipiac University's journalism school, both their master's and bachelor's programs. And I grew up in Denver, Colorado, so across the country from Quinnipiac. But I was looking for something different after high school. And so when I found Quinnipiac and their journalism program, I looked there, I applied without even having seen the school because it was still during COVID at that point, and things came together really nicely and fell into place as things do. And I had an amazing experience. I met amazing people, amazing mentors throughout my 4 years at Quinnipiac, and I'm so grateful for the tools that they've given me and my peers to be able to tell stories, to be able to ask the tough questions, and to be able to go into these topics that often are not covered enough or a lot at all in the media.
Well, wonderful. And I'd love to jump into what you said, because there's a certain power to telling stories. And I'm intrigued, Jack, by what put you on your journey. What were the key things in your life that put you on this journey to say, I'm yearning to tell stories? And if you could speak a little bit about your capstone and how you came to choose that, because the amazing thing that we've seen in our family's journey over the last 10 years is the miracle of life and how we've connected to different people who have just amazing backgrounds, amazing stories, and doing amazing work. And they tend to intersect at the right moments, in time. And, somehow the universe intersected you and our organization. It always fascinates me to sort of see the journeys that people take to get them to where they are. So if you could dive into that a little bit, Jack.
Absolutely. So I credit my desire to go into journalism to my parents wholly. I grew up, I'm Jewish, and one of the core Jewish values is tikkun olam. It's repair the world. Leave the world a better place than you found it. And I've always grown up on trying to change the world for the better, whether that's through advocating for the causes that my family, my parents believed in, or going out and canvassing for XYZ, or practicing leave no trace policies when I'm out hiking in the mountains of Colorado or anywhere in the world. So it's always been about change for me. And so the way that manifested into journalism was, it sort of, looking back on it, it all makes sense. I grew up, I was not a normal kid over the summers who would watch cartoons over the summer. I'd wake up and I'd put on the Today Show and I'd watch the 4 o'clock news in middle school. very typical, right? So when I believe I was in my sophomore year of high school, I sort of had this realization that I could actually do this for a living, and make a career out of this. And so I sort of set my sights on broadcast journalism. That was where I really wanted to go. One, because TV is cool in simple terms, but two, it's a way to make change that is in its DNA about telling the truth and holding people accountable and holding power to account in particular. And again, I'll reiterate, the core of it is telling the truth. And I think that's so important, especially today when even simple facts and simple truths are disputed. And so really harping on that fundamental truth is a very important way to create change. And so as I went through my years at Quinnipiac, we learned all of the nuts and bolts to journalism, how to tell a story, how to tell a long-form story, how to properly interview subjects and come at things with a perspective of objectivity, but also knowing that not everything has two sides. If something's racist, you don't have to say, this person said it was racist. It's just racist, pure and simple. It's that simple. So learning things like that was a super important part of my learning in journalism there. And as I graduated with my bachelor's and was preparing for my master's degree, I knew I had another capstone project, an enterprise project to work on for my master's program. And when it comes to stories like these, I don't look at it as just another assignment in the grade book, but I look at it as something that will be beneficial for me to show off what I've learned over the past 4 years, but also it can be an opportunity for others to tell their stories. And that's what I find one of the most impactful ways of storytelling, is to just be a vessel for somebody else to tell their story, because everybody has a story. And that was one of the core things that was taught to us, was that always remember the people that you're interviewing. Everybody has a story. Everybody's a human, just like you are. Report with compassion, report with empathy, but keep people's feet to the fire if that's what it takes. And so as I was sort of developing my ideas for my master's capstone, I was a little bit lost. And I was talking with some family members about a family member of mine who was sexually assaulted in school. And we were talking about how that particular incident there was no discipline given to the perpetrator at all. It was improperly reported, and there was never any consequences. It was you should go talk to that kid's parents. And I thought to myself, I was like, that's really screwed up. Like, there's got to be some laws about this, right? There's got to be something about it. And so it really got the wheels turning in my brain that there's something really screwed up about our systems. So I sort of went down every path thinking about I could go down the path of access to justice when it comes to various socioeconomic areas that sexual assaults may happen in, more or less. I could go down the route of solely listening to people tell their stories, or I could go down the path of trying to get the audience, readers, listeners to understand how these cultures are formed and how they are fostered, and how abuses of power empower perpetrators to do what they do while keeping victims and survivors at the front of this, because it's rare that we hear from the actual survivors in these stories, if we even hear these stories at all. It's oftentimes these big Hollywood names that have these big cases against them, which are important to uncover those, but we oftentimes don't hear about what the victims actually went through unless, unfortunately, something tragic happens. I think even just recently with the Jeffrey Epstein cases and how Virginia Giuffre was probably not a name a lot of people knew until the past year or two when the news of her suicide became a thing. I mean, I had never heard of her until that news came about. And so it's past the time that we start letting people tell their stories before it's too late.
Thank you, Jack. It kind of resonated with me when you said your project was focusing more on like understanding why. It's important that these stories are told, but often this media and like culture that is promoted in society often censors, those stories. So I think it's important to understand why. And I was thinking about my own experience. I did a research project this summer, more so on like masculinity in media, but also on like gender norms and sexual assault numbers, etc. And I researched studies across like video games, primetime television, films, and really all the media that, society absorbs. And in every aspect of it, there was some form of, promotion of gender roles from like Fred Flintstone and as early as that in like the 60s and even to now to social media with like TikTok, Andrew Tate, and, misogynistic influencers. But I think what I found is interesting is that media is almost like the perpetrator in itself because it's really the one preserving the culture and promoting it. And it's really hard to stop. But I think that, through projects like yours and more awareness around this topic, I think people will start to understand more the impact that these media outlets has on them.
Yeah, that's a really important point that you bring up. And I'll say from my perspective, I think on a lot of things, the media and the news media is often used as a scapegoat to blame for many other problems. And that I don't want that to get misconstrued as an exoneration of the media for these things, because there are plenty of examples of very, very poor journalism and journalistic ethics, especially surrounding sexual assault. But you're 100% right in that the media other than the news media, so any shows, TV, movies that we consume absolutely reinforce these gender roles. You can look at it in terms of hosts, in terms of even I think like just going to something as simple as sports, play-by-play broadcasters. It is heavily dominated by men when there are plenty of just as if not more qualified female broadcasters in that realm. And whenever a woman is given a job at like one of the four in broadcasting one of the four major sports, whether it's at a regional network or at a national network, you can already predict what the Twitter comments are. Even when they do a fantastic job, there's always something about they're replacing someone who is totally fine at their job, or DEI hire, or something like that, which is just totally baseless and it's not called out enough. And so it's things like that that absolutely reinforce those gender norms and societal expectations.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you just said, Jack. And I also just want to get back to what we were talking about with cultures. And I think because these different, like, these cultures of rape and sexual assault, it's so deeply ingrained in our society. And I think often a lot of journalism, people will try to pick apart different articles and take out pieces from here or there to kind of put together some flawed argument that makes zero sense whatsoever. But I know you can really focus on photojournalism, and I think especially photography, it's a very important media that you can't really take away, and what's out there is really the fact, and it's you can't look away from something like that. So I think when you put out photos kind of showing a situation and showing the truth, I think that can really just put a spotlight on something that sometimes articles can't, because that can really put an image to someone's face, and they don't just have to imagine what's happening, but they can actually see it in person, and they can't kind of avoid the article or skim past it and being like, okay, yeah, I read that, but they really have to come face to face with what's happening. So I would want to ask you, how do you think you can use photojournalism, or how have you used photojournalism throughout your career and in college and in your master's program to really kind of depict these different cultures and kind of try to change their cultures and what's happening with them?
Yeah, photography, I've always enjoyed photography and taking photos, and it wasn't until college that I realized that photojournalism was a real thing, and that there are people who do that as their full-time jobs. And I really learned the power that comes with taking a single frame. You literally can stop time, you can stop history, because those are the things that are remembered forever, are the images. Nobody's gonna remember who wrote the article about this big historic event. No, people don't remember the exact article that was written about 9/11, but people remember the image of George Bush at Ground Zero after that happened. That's what we remember. And so that power is remarkable. I think about it as we see a camera, cameras for the most part, it's a single lens and a single click. Even just our eyes are two lenses. We have two eyes. And so you can literally stop time. I think the way you described it was really, really eloquent, in that when you see a photo, you can't unsee it necessarily. That is what it is. There's no, obviously you can interpret what the story of the photo is per se, but that doesn't change the actual content of a photo. And so using that to put faces to stories, to add context to stories, I think especially in conflict zones in particular, the images that we see really show the scale of destruction, of devastation. You can see anguish on people's face. You can see happiness on people's face. And that is true in any type of photography, in any photo. So with a story like this, I really wanted to focus on putting a face to the names and to the stories of the people who were willing to speak to me, to try and help give them some power back. But also, it's almost all the stories we hear, which for good reason, the victims are anonymous. Jane Does. And that's one thing that we discussed, that Alex and Susan and I discussed on my podcast, was the use of Jane Does, especially in court proceedings. And so allowing people to see the faces, that it's not just this arbitrary person that is being victimized. These are real people, just like you and I. And so being able to take those photos, those transcend language barriers. You don't need to know English or Spanish or Hindi or whatever to look at an image and to see what story that image is trying to convey.
Jack, so, you said something that has really sort of stuck with me in terms of the reference to the Jewish tradition, which I think is such a beautiful, simple statement, leave the world a better place. And please tell me how that message imbued itself in this wonderful podcast that you've done. And tell me a little bit about, what are some of the things that you experienced or learned during the process of producing the podcast?
So that value, like I said, is something that I have grown up with my whole life. If you walk into many Jewish homes, you'll often see posters with that written in Hebrew, or some visual depiction of repairing the world. Because as much as we would like it to be otherwise, there's always some fracture in the world. There's always some conflict. There's always, unfortunately, it's never all rainbows and butterflies, but we can each work to make this world a better place. And there are so many different ways for people to do that. And the way it manifested in this project was, I saw how much this assault affected my family member. And I also saw how strong that person was in the aftermath of that in the years following. And through that, I found that talking about it was very helpful to both the person it happened to their parents, to anyone else who was somewhat directly affected by that. And I wanted to try and be a vessel for other people's voices as well. Because as a journalist, the story is not about me. It's not about what I'm doing. It's not about the places I want to go in life. It's about the people that speak to you, that are willing to trust you with their story. And seeing how the messages I got from the people I spoke with after doing the interviews and publishing the podcast, saying that they have mended relationships with people in their lives, and that they now feel more empowered to do various things that they didn't feel comfortable doing in the past. It's validated the reasons I wanted to do this podcast, but I'll reiterate, it's not about me. If the podcast that I do impacts even just one person to speak up for themselves, to make an effort to mend a relationship that might be fractured in their lives, then it's all worth it. That's repairing the world. That's Tikkun Olam in action. And so that's really how it manifested in this project.
Yeah, I just want to talk about what you were saying, how you just want to leave one thing out there, and if it impacts one person, how much really effect it can have. Because I know often in our podcast we talk about the ripple effect, and it's basically if you just drop one pebble in a lake or in a pond somewhere, it really just ripples around, and it can have such a dramatic impact on so many people. And I think especially podcasts, because all you really have to do is listen, plus press play, and you can hear some really stories that just can really change your impact, change your opinions, and just change your narrative and change what you really hear, because there's never really one side to a story unless it's something that's very objective. But often it's such complex stories. But I think often, especially when sexual assaults happen in schools, the narrative is that often the school will just cover up whatever happens and they'll just throw money at the situation, like what happened with Chessie at St. Paul's, and all they do is just throw money on the situation and cover it up. So I know you said it's really helpful just to talk to the victim and what happened with them, but also I think to kind of take it even a step further, really pushing back against the school and seeing what the school did and how they can really change for the future so it doesn't happen again, and not having it be kind of an aftermath. Okay, let me be there for you after, but instead taking the step before so it doesn't happen again. Would you say that more photojournalism would be the way that you want to talk to schools and really make it not happen again, or would you want it to be more documenting the schools or talking to them face to face and maybe addressing different courses that can be implemented at the school? Or would you want to go back to Denver and do that there? Or would you want to kind of take it back and maybe somewhere in the Quinnipiac area?
Yeah, it's a question that I still don't know the answer to be totally honest with you. I think there's so many different ways, even just in the journalism realm, there's so many different ways to affect change, and there's not one right answer. It's not only photos aren't going to change everything. Only hearing one story is not going to change everything, but everything together. And if you repeatedly are sharing these stories, we would hope that, and by we I mean as a society, as a well-functioning society, we would hope that would lead schools and any place that has issues like these towards change. And while I don't know if my podcast or anybody else's podcast or anyone else's journalistic work is going to be the thing that makes that happen, I think that just even starting to report on these issues in a frank way is where we need to be. Because even as I was developing the idea and the pitch to do this as my project, as my capstone, I got pushback from some people saying, one of the pieces of feedback I received, and I won't say who said it, and I don't mean this with any ill will, but one of the pieces of feedback was, what aspect of rape culture are you trying to change? And I looked at that piece of feedback, and I was like, maybe the rape part of it, maybe the culture part of it, maybe all of it. And I was told it's going to be hard for you to find people to talk to about this. And while it was not easy, one of the things that I learned once I connected with Alex and Susan was that unfortunately, there are so many people out there who have been affected by sexual violence, and there are so many people who just want to be heard and listened to and will be willing to tell their stories. And they told me that it probably won't be that hard to find people to talk to. And they were right. I think just about all the people I spoke with were willing to go on the record and talk about in detail what happened to them and what they faced and what they're doing now. And the things that they said hopefully strike a nerve within the perpetrators, with potential future perpetrators, with people in power who are fostering these cultures of rape. And so to sort of put a button on your question, there's so many different ways to affect change. And so being able to listen to someone tell their story, or look at a photo, or watch a video from someone, those are all equally powerful in their own ways.
So I have a question, Jack, because I know you mentioned, obviously you have a great kind of interest in broadcast journalism, at least more so than written journalism, if I'm not wrong about that. But I think in my eyes, like, broadcast journalism on social media has been kind of effectively reduced to like short clips and messages that are often kind of cut off or not fully seen, like whether it's debates or stories that are kind of half told in a sense, and that are put out through like algorithms and more so like rewarded on their popularity, and it doesn't matter whether like half of it's cut off, but if it's telling one message in that small clip, then I think people kind of go to it and becomes very popular. But how do you see in your eyes like the future of broadcast journalism to that regard, and how will social media kind of continue to persist in that way, and how can you kind of help that?
That's a great question. One of the things that many of my professors made it a point in classes to talk about was that at the end of the day, journalism is a business. And a lot of times these big newspapers in particular are owned by these, and broadcasters for that matter, are owned by these huge conglomerates. I think the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. The Wall Street Journal is owned by Rupert Murdoch, or at least was. So while there are still plenty of good reporters and good journalism taking place at these outlets, that doesn't mean there's not monetary incentives to produce certain pieces of content. And I think that's where a lot of trust in journalism has been lost. Because like you said, it's on social media. We know that our people our age, and any age, our attention spans are very, very short. So you have to try and rope someone in as quick as you possibly can. And so if that is starting with an out of context soundbite, then you might have a higher up saying, that's okay, if that grabs their attention. And that's and I think that's for better or for worse, because if you can keep that audience retention, then, and get them to watch the whole video and see that same quote in context, then that's great. But that doesn't often happen, and people will see something and they can hit repost in an instant. That is the push and pull of social media, is that you can get fantastic engagement on really good journalism and really good stories, but misinformation and disinformation can spread just as fast, if not even faster. And so in terms of broadcasting, I think local news is still so important. And even just looking super recently with Nexstar acquiring Tegna, which are two of the biggest owners of local news stations, that's a big deal in terms of the dissemination of information. That means TV stations combining. That means people losing their jobs. That means less people there to fact check something, to take a second look at a story. And that is concerning to some extent, but I still know that, especially in local news, there are so many good journalists out there who are committed to telling the truth and to exposing power and keeping power accountable. And so the future, I think if anybody tries to predict the future of journalism, they're a fool right now. So, but I think broadcast news and local broadcast news is super, super important, and is something that needs to be protected, to be frank.
And Jack, you mentioned sort of the challenges you had, or the challenges you were told you would have in terms of finding survivors willing to speak up. Tell me a little bit of what the sort of the background of what it meant to find, an esteemed professor on your campus, Charlie Pillsbury. And, learning about the story of Charlie connecting with Chessie. Tell me a little bit about, the impact of, hearing their combined stories.
Yeah. I I know that this this whole thing obviously came together through many degrees of connection, but the fact that Charlie Pillsbury happened to be a professor at Quinnipiac, I say is nothing more than a remarkable coincidence. When I was pitching this story, one of our assignments in the fall was to read a book on our topic that we were doing. And this is someone who has not read a book from front to back in probably 10 years. But I picked up Chessie's book, I Have the Right To, and that was the first book I read cover to cover in years. And as much as I dreaded that assignment, if it wasn't for that assignment, I would not have made it to the point in that story that I did. And that was the first way that I was able to connect with you and Susan, Alex. And then you suggested Charlie and said he was a professor at Quinnipiac. And I was like, this is remarkable. And it also shows that it is rare, if not completely unheard of, for someone to know nobody that has been affected by sexual violence in their lives. Even if you don't know it, someone you know has probably faced sexual assault or anything in that realm, male or female. And so having that, another thing I struggled with through the early stages of the project was finding relevance to Quinnipiac and to my local community. But then once Charlie came into the picture, that just completely sealed the deal for that. And not only was it a win for that aspect, but if I'm not mistaken, that was the first time that Charlie and Chessie have done a proper interview together, the two of them sharing their story. And that someone like Charlie, who is, like you mentioned, an esteemed law professor, has also been affected by sexual violence. It shows that nobody is immune to it, that there is no, Chessie says it best, that there's no perfect victim. So being able to speak with Charlie, who went through something at the same place, something similar to Chessie, two extraordinarily different people, but went through something so similar at the same place, really helped to underscore the fact that you all uncovered in the book and through your work that there was a deep, deep culture of rape and sexual assault at St. Paul's, and that there are similar cultures elsewhere, and it goes on forever and ever until somebody has the courage to speak up. And that is a peril of our society right now, is that it takes so many people, so many wrongs for someone to say something. And then that's what only gets the ball rolling. That doesn't even fix the issues, as you all found. And so talking with them both really contextualized the issue and the culture that was fostered at St. Paul's, that It had been going on for 40 years, and nothing had changed.
Yep. And, thinking again of what you said, repairing the world, to how many hundreds of victims at St. Paul's School could have led very different lives if the school had taken that concept to heart of repairing the world when Charlie Pillsbury was assaulted as a young boy at the school. And the consequences of decisions you make. And it takes a lot of courage to speak up, as you noted, Jack, but it also takes a lot of courage to put these messages out there. So I congratulate you for your courage. I highly suggest our listeners to listen to Jack's podcast. The link to Jack's podcast, In Their Words, A Culture of Rape, and Hearing the Voices of Survivors, the link is in the notes below. And I want to bring this to a conclusion today, Jack. First of all, by saying thank you for having the courage to put this out in the world. For everyone's information, Susan and I made a trek to Quinnipiac to meet Jack, to suss him out, to see, could we trust him? And that was a very short process. We sort of learned very quickly what a genuine young man this is. And Jack, I've appreciated this opportunity to speak to you in more detail because I've learned more about you that tells me you're going to be doing great things in this world going forward. So I ask our audience to, if you come across Jack, help him in this journey. You will be hearing more from him in the future. I am sure of that. And I would just like to close this out with what Jack has gifted us as an important message of leaving this world a better place, repairing the world. Nothing more can be more important, especially in this day and age. And my question to you, our audience, is what will you do? Thank you to our audience. Thank you, Jack. And thank you to my co-hosts, Hugh and Gabriel. What will you do? Thank you so much for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on all platforms. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends about Aspire. Follow us on social media at I Have the Right To. Learn more about our student and executive programming at our website at ihavetherightto.org.